Well, hey, welcome to Compass. I am Chris, the pastor, and I'm really glad you're with me. So no matter where you go, if there are people, they will see the world differently. And that can be in small things like whether or not you like cilantro, or if you thought the Barbie movie was good. I'm in the good category. I thought its examination of how the patriarchy hurts men as well as women was just a chef's kiss. But we can also see the world differently in not just small things, but in weird things, like whether or not UFOs are real, or if the earth is flat. Now that's a hopeful yes for me, and a flat no for me, no pun intended. It can also extend to big life-altering things, these disagreements, like how far should bodily autonomy extend? Is assisted suicide okay? And what justifies war? I think that much of how we see the world is driven by what we want, what we need, and what we think we deserve. So what we desire, what we require, and what we've earned by our actions and our behavior. These motivators direct how we see the world in the small things, in the weird things, and also in the big things. They also affect how we see God. Is there a God? How does he relate to us? And what does he want from us? The story we're going to look at today is a perfect example of how we can see things so differently. Because today we're going to look at the story of when Jesus flipped over the tables in the temple. Now we find it right here in Matthew 21, verse 12. It says, Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out all the people buying and selling animals for sacrifice. He knocked over the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves. And he said to them, "The scriptures declare, my temple will be called a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of thieves." So in short, when we look at this story, we can see that Jesus is unhappy with what's going on in the temple. And he says that it has become a den of thieves. Now, there's no disagreement on what Jesus did. Okay, it's right here in the story. He went into the temple, he flipped the tables and the chairs of the people who were selling animals and trading money who were there in the temple. But the difference of opinion comes in how we apply this story to our lives today. I mean, think about it. What does this story mean to you today? And how would you apply it in our world? If you're a follower of Jesus, or even if you're just a person who's exploring Jesus to see if he's worth following, what would you take away from this story that would change how you live, what you do? How would you follow Jesus in the act of flipping over tables? Well, it should come as no surprise that there are many different interpretations of this event. Many Christians look at it as a justification for being aggressive and outspoken in how we confront sin in our world. And we can see this in things like the movement to ban books in school libraries. Say Jesus was aggressive in opposing sin in his world, and sometimes we have to do the same thing, especially on Facebook. Now, some people see in the story of flipping tables a mandate to stand up to people in power. And whether it's politicians or corporations, the people in power need to be stood up to so that we can advocate for regular people, to stand against corruption in government. Some other people see it as a justification for the destruction of property as a valid form of protest. Jesus destroyed property to protest injustice, so we can apply that to our world by being willing to destroy property in the same way. Now, you can see the differences in worldview between all of these different takes on the same story. My personal favorite, though, is the result when someone prompted an AI art generator to show Jesus flipping over tables. And the result was an image of Jesus literally flipping over a table. Now, I'm pretty sure that doesn't mean we should practice our backflips, even though part of me wishes that it were. But if we're going to understand Jesus and understand him how he is, rather than how we want him to be, need him to be, or think we deserve him to be, we need to understand the things he did and said in the context that he did and said them in. We need to get to the heart of Jesus's want, need, and deserve if we're going to be able to live like he lived and think like he thought and do what he taught. So let's take a second to look at this story again. Again, in Matthew chapter 21, verse 12. Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out all the people buying and selling animals for sacrifice. He knocked over the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves. And he said to them, "The scriptures declare, my temple will be called a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of thieves. So again, we look at this and we can see what Jesus did. Jesus cleansed the temple by flipping the tables of the money changers and of the people who were selling animals for sacrifice there in the temple. But why were those people in the temple to begin with? I mean, why were they there at all? Well, there were actually pretty good reasons for them to be there. Because when people came to the temple to make sacrifices, they had to bring their own animals. And this may have been fine for people who lived in the area around Jerusalem, but if your trip took days or you lived in the city, bringing animals for sacrifice was problematic, especially if you were bringing birds. And so to accommodate people, these booths to sell animals were set up in the outer court of the temple. It was set up for convenience for people. And the money changers, they were there for a very similar reason, because Rome had conquered the lands of Israel. And as a result, Roman coins were the currency of the land. And these Roman coins were engraved with the image of Caesar or the image of the goddess Roma. Now, this was deeply offensive to the Jewish people because to them, these coins were idolatry. So as a result, Roman coins weren't allowed to be used in the temple. And so again, for convenience, money changers set up in the outer courts of the temple in order to exchange Roman currency for temple currency so people could give their offerings and pay the temple tax without committing idolatry with Roman coins. Now, these things on their own are not problematic. They only become a big deal when you realize that the money changers and the sacrifice salesmen were gouging people with exorbitant fees. It might cost $2 in Roman coins to exchange for $1 in temple coins. And the salesmen were doing the same thing, selling sacrifices, because the temple courtyard was the only place you could buy animals for sacrifice. They overcharged. It's like when you go to the airport and you pay $6 for a bottled water that you could have bought at the gas station for $1, but you have to do it because you don't have any other options. You can't bring bottled water past, TSA, and so you're just stuck with it. It's a ripoff and everybody knows it, but there's nothing that you can do. So these practices were in effect in the temple, and they were symptomatic of the corruption that had taken root in the temple. And we can see why these things would have upset Jesus. But Jesus also quoted two statements from the Old Testament prophets that give us an even clearer view of why he did what he did. And the first we can find here in Isaiah chapter 56, verse 6. This is what Isaiah writes. Speaking for God, he says, I will bless the foreigners who commit themselves to the Lord, who serve him and love his name, who worship him and do not desecrate the Sabbath day of rest, and who hold fast to my covenant. I will bring them to my holy mountain of Jerusalem and will fill them with joy in my house of prayer. I will accept their burnt offerings and sacrifices because my temple will be called a house of prayer for all nations. Now, this is the passage that Jesus quotes part of. He says, my temple will be called a house of prayer. But I want you to look at who's being referred to when Isaiah says this. It's being referred to in the context of foreigners, of Gentiles. I will bless the foreigners and fill them with joy in my house of prayer. My temple will be called a house of prayer for all nations. God's heart is that his temple be for everyone. Now check this out. This is the temple in Jerusalem, okay? The main temple structure is at the center courtyard, surrounded by another huge courtyard. And do you want to know what that huge courtyard was called? It was called the Court of Gentiles, because that was the place in the temple complex that foreigners could go. They couldn't pass into any of the other temple spaces. And guess where the money changers and animal salesmen were set up? In the Court of the Gentiles. While foreigners were allowed into this temple space, it wasn't a space of worship as much as it was a bazaar for buying and selling. Not the house of prayer that God intended for Gentiles. Not a place for outsiders to find welcome. Jesus quoted another prophet when he said that the temple had become a den of thieves. And look at this. This is Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 3. God says, reform your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. It's a lot of repetition, but Jeremiah said these words to a corrupt king and to a nation that was in decline, because the people of Israel had broken their covenant with God by worshiping idols and pagan gods. And Jeremiah was warning them that their actions would lead to destruction, but they didn't listen. In fact, they thought Jerusalem would never fall because the temple of the Lord was there. They thought they would be safe just because of their proximity to the temple. But Jeremiah was like, guys, it doesn't work that way. Because he goes on in verse 5. If you really change your ways and your actions, and you deal with each other justly, if you don't oppress the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow, and you do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave your ancestors forever and ever. So you can see God speaking to the people, but he's frustrated, he's angry. And what was it that made God so angry? What were the ways and actions that he wanted the people of Israel to change? Well, there was injustice in the land. Marginalized people were being oppressed, even to death. Widows, orphans, foreigners, they were being hurt and oppressed. The people didn't love their neighbors. They didn't love the Lord with all their heart, soul, and strength. They were worshiping idols. And they thought that they could do whatever they wanted because the temple was there and it made them safe. We continue in verse 8 of Jeremiah 7. But look, you are trusting in deceptive words that are worthless. Will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal and follow other gods you haven't known, and then come and stand before me in this house which bears my name and say, we are safe? Safe to do all these detestable things? Has this house which bears my name become a den of robbers to you? So according to Jeremiah, the thing that made the temple a den of robbers and thieves was that they followed other gods and that they didn't care for others. They didn't love the Lord with all their heart, and they didn't love their neighbor as themselves. And when Jesus calls back to these scriptures, he's saying the same thing. That this temple is supposed to be a house of prayer for all people, but instead it's become a place that only serves to further isolate and marginalize them. What was meant to be a place of righteousness had actually become a place that furthered the injustice in the world. The religious structures that were designed to bring justice and lead people to God had been corrupted into doing the exact opposite. When I look at all of this through the eyes of Jesus, through what he did, through the scriptures that motivated him to do it, I think it gives us a better idea of how we can apply this to our lives, because it gives us a better understanding. And it starts with the understanding that Jesus flips the tables of corrupted religion. When he crosses paths with terrible sinners, he didn't flip tables. He dealt with them in love. And when he was tempted to take on the powers that be, the Roman authorities, with force, he refused. The fire of Jesus flipping tables was reserved for corrupted institutions that furthered injustice, hurt the marginalized, and kept them from inclusion in the life of those committed to God. Now, this may resonate with you because you see a lot to criticize in the church today, from the way it's furthered injustice to how the church has created courtyards for people to keep them outside the center of church life. And you're not wrong. And while we should flip the tables of injustice within our church structures, the church is not hopeless. Because while the religious structures of the church may struggle, the church that Jesus is building can still be the temple he intended. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16 through 17. It says this. It says, don't you realize that all of you together are the temple of God and that the Spirit of God lives in you? God will destroy anyone who destroys this temple, for God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. There's hope for the church because the church is you and me. Jesus confronted the temple system of his day, not just to tear it down, but to build something better in its place. A temple of human beings made in the image of God. Heaven and earth don't come together in one place, but within many people. God's presence is with us and in us. And that's why God is so passionate when the religious structures that are supposed to bring people to him are hurting them instead. When the temples that we build hurt the temple that he is building. God's temple still brings hope, justice, and light into the world. Only now it's not a place, but a people. You bring hope, justice, and light into the world as you carry God with you. Knowing that, I guess the last thing we need to do is ask ourselves this. If I'm the temple of God, what tables do I need to flip in my own life? Are there idols that I place before God? Things that I worship without even being aware that they've become the priority in my life? Things like money, education, hobbies, our children, career success. Perhaps today you need to work on loving God with your whole heart. Maybe for you it's not idols, but it's the damage that you've done and are still doing to other people. Your actions and your attitudes, even though they felt right, have caused injustice, hurt, and oppression in the lives of others. You've said and done cruel things. You've taken advantage of people. You've been selfish. Maybe you've even excluded people from being involved in the life of the church. Perhaps you need to work on loving your neighbor as yourself. Jesus flipped tables, but it was always in the service of loving God and loving our neighbor, just like everything else he did. He took on religious structures that prevented those things from happening, and he encourages us to do the same, even if those religious structures are within our own hearts. We are the temple of God. So may we be willing to change and be sensitive to God's call to love him with our whole heart and to love our neighbor as ourselves. I'll see you next time.